Welcome to the podcast of the International Youth Conference. Today's topic is social distance and distrust.
Hello everyone, my name is Anelia and welcome to the first podcast of the International Youth Conference. We are in the process of preparation of the upcoming 18th International Youth Conference, and we will be covering different kind of topics which are interesting and burning for the young people in the region. Today with me is Katerina Krusevo, full professor of philosophy and political science and senior researcher at the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities of Skopje. Katerina, hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm dealing with some technical smaller issues, but other than that, fine. I'm with you now. So, yes, I heard the question and the presentation. I was absent just for a quick moment to plug in my charger. So the question is about solidarity in times of COVID crisis and social distancing as something which kind of goes hand in hand with solidarity, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem with the notion of solidarity, since it emerged as one of the central values promulgated as kind of a global, let's say, social consensus or contract, even on a basis of a new contract, I would say, of dealing with the threat of the pandemic globally. So the central value of this sort since the beginning has been the notion of solidarity. The notion of solidarity is something that can be thought, conceived, and used in all sorts of different ways. It depends on who pronounces the term, from what position, and from which position in terms of social power and political power, and for what purposes. I, for one thing, am always skeptical or wary when it is the state, so those in power, government, who appeal to solidarity, to the citizens, to the entire nation, to entire nations, they appeal to all these masses of people through the value of solidarity in order to invite compliance with the policies of the state in dealing with the crisis, with that which causes the state of emergencies, in this case the pandemic crisis. I mean, I'm no anarchist, and I don't think that we should disobey the rules of the governments. I'm no anarchist indeed, I mean, in principle, not just regarding this issue. So, and I'm not even that much of a liberal to oppose lockdowns if necessary, to oppose the strong role of the state if necessary. I can understand that it is sometimes necessary, and we have to comply with it. And we have to understand these rules as conditions for the state to be the enabler of the preserving of our public health. I understand that, and I respect that. But in situations like that, we have to make clear that we are, first of all, complying with the requests of the state. Since it is a state of emergency, we cannot be way too critical to throw off balance the state, the society, the normality that is maintained with extra effort on the part of the state. So that's why our questioning of the policies of the state has to be kind of reserved, cautious. So there should be a discussion, but there shouldn't be such protests like the ones we have in Berlin right now. So what I'm saying is I'm even slightly conservative in that respect. And yet again, I have to be critical toward the Macedonian civil society during the COVID crisis, because it did not, it did not, with a number of very rare exceptions, it did not question the policies. It did not question how proportionate they were, the question of excessiveness of certain measures of restriction, the question of sacrificing civil liberties in the name of prevention from the spreading of the disease, the prevention of the health catastrophe. So the fact that there was no questioning whatsoever whether the measures were proportionate, whether they were excessive, whether some of them were perhaps not even necessary or did not quite make sense in terms of containing the pandemic, but sometimes seemed like simply an insensitive totalitarian mode of dealing with the problem, since there were blanket measures, like everybody is quarantined from this to this hour, everybody is quarantined from this to this day, everybody, regardless of their disease, unless a question of life and death, are not going to go to the hospital, but somehow deal with the pain themselves, because we have the emergency of the COVID crisis. So we did have this excessive restrictiveness and complete disregard for certain social groups in terms of public health. I would call them social groups. You know, people with chronic diseases, with cancer, with other diseases. These are also social groups, because public health is a social category. People with dementia, depressed people, all of these categories of people, or people with different specificities, like, I don't know, victims of home violence, whatever. There are so many societal and individual exceptions that ought to be respected, but were not quite in most of the time during the crisis and the state of emergency. So, as I said at the beginning, I am kind of conservative. I'm not even too liberal. I am for lockdowns. I am in favor of certain restrictions in order to contain the pandemic. But on the other hand, one must not allow that these measures are excessive. And finally, reaching to the point about the civil society, one must not allow a civil society that is in solidarity with the state, but not with the society. There cannot be an equation between the state and the society. if we do that equation, we are ending up in a totalitarian mode. We are speaking the language of Viktor Orban. His party, himself, are the incarnation of the Hungarian nation. So that's the logic, the reasoning of the Liberal Democrats, this is what he calls himself, or the totalitarians or authoritarians, call it what you will. Authoritarians ruling right-wing, authoritarians ruling through populism. So this is their logic. Solidarity and complete collapse, identification of the nation with the ruling party and with the state. So no, solidarity, absolute solidarity with the state and complete support for the state in enacting the measures is not the job of a civil society. A civil society should be a watchdog to the government, even in times of crisis. A responsible civil society could know and recognize the limits, of course, of their critique, because it's a state of emergency or state of exception, can recognize those limits, but still within those limits mark the disproportionality of the measures and criticize them. To sum up, I finished 2 international studies, most of them regional, concerning not just Western Balkans, but the wider Southeast Europe. In both of those studies that are about to be published, it appears that North Macedonia was the only country where the civil society did not perform any role whatsoever, with a handful, literally 4 exceptions of monitoring and being a watchdog for the civil rights and liberties in defense of the citizens, and as a kind of a monitoring instance, and a watchdog, fulfilling a watchdog role toward the government. That thing has not existed in Macedonia during the COVID crisis state of emergency. Mainly we're talking about spring, and throughout Southeastern Europe, we are literally the only exception where you can hardly find any example of the civil society performing its role of a watchdog. So yes, solidarity with the society, with the citizens, understanding and support for the citizens that cannot be proportionately treated, or the state fails to proportionately treat them, considering their specific social needs or individual needs. So civil society, first of all, in solidarity with the people, with the regular citizens, with the society. Second of all, of course, support for the general policy of the government, since it's a state of exception, but also inside of this support, creating a space of critique and opening up a debate. I'm sorry, but nobody in this country, none of the human rights organizations or any other think tank or activist movement or individual, okay, with the exception of some individuals, raised the question as to why Macedonia was one of the 8 countries that derogated from the European Charter of Human Rights during the COVID crisis. And on most counts, we are top 1 on the number of counts from which we derogated. Then you have Serbia, then you have Albania, then Bosnia that later on retreated, and a couple of former Soviet republics. That says a lot. all the other European countries found a way to enforce a state of emergency while not derogating from the European Charter of Human Rights. This question was never opened within our civil society, which is symptomatic.
Now I would like to proceed with one term which was very popular in the past period, social distancing. So according to your opinion, whether it's more important to talk about social distancing or physical distancing, whether the social distancing term, usage of the term of the social distancing was misused during this crisis?
Yeah, it's kind of symptomatic that so many opted for the word social distancing, although it turns out that we are kind of also ending up being socially distanced from one another. For example, my daughter finished her second year of high school online without seeing her peers. She will continue online without seeing her peers. I am in favor of online learning for the upcoming year because we don't know what's going to happen in the fall, winter, so I guess it's safe to do that. So here is another example. I can accept and affirm a measure imposed by the government, but that does not prevent me from criticizing certain aspects of not so much the measure, but the effects that it will have on the society, and find ways to counter those negative effects. So the point is that whether we like it or not, the physical distancing is ending up being social distancing. This is why I gave the example with the school. On the other hand, it's kind of apparent that for the time being, online schooling work for those for whom that is an option, it's a possibility, is the best way to go about the pandemic, at least for the time being, at least until winter. We will see about later on. But what we need to take into consideration and kind of find ways to resist the negative effects of this policies as far as the social tissue is concerned. So the things that we should criticize in order not for these policies not to affect the health of the social of the tissue of the society I was talking about are the following. First of all, the physical distancing should be understood as a necessity ad hoc necessity with regard to the current crisis, which is not going to last forever. We should be aware that the physical distancing sometimes means amounts to social distancing, and at that point we should be critical about it, or we should perform the role of watchdogs with regard to this negative effect. Considering the physical distancing amounts to social distancing and people being more atomized during the crisis, we should advocate for all sorts of alternative measures in order to keep a community and keep some social interaction offline as well. For example, if it's not possible and it's not advisable indeed to, I don't know, start the schools with, in the normal way, offline with full capacity, etc. And it is not. And if it is recommended, and I agree with the recommendation that most of the teaching process goes on online. So if we agree, and I do agree with that principle, that does not mean that we should remain blind to the fact that the children are being atomized and social distancing, social alienation is taking place. And this should be countered. For example, I don't know, once a week they could perhaps meet in some open space for some kind of informal workshop that will be, organized according to certain protocols, or I don't know, several groups of workshops once a week around a project or whatever, simply to keep the group and the unity and the sense of community in place. So what I am proposing is complying with the state policy of online learning. I am in favor of that, but considering the adverse effects of social distancing, I'm proposing some alternative modes of enabling the students to get together offline in safe circumstances, I don't know, twice a month or something like that, simply to prevent the physical distancing from becoming a real social distancing.
And secondly, I would like to ask you, what do you think, how mentality of different nations in the region caused or brought this solidarity in crisis?
I'm so much against the use of this term because it's a vague term and it's used vaguely. It's used by politicians, it's used in everyday conversation. It's full of stereotypes, so racism and auto-racism, I would say. Mentality is something that can be studied scientifically. It can be studied scientifically from a psychological point of view, insofar as society can be studied from a psychological point of view, but I think that this approach is limited. It can be studied from the aspect of anthropology or cultural studies, cultural anthropology or cultural studies, interdisciplinary, in an interdisciplinary way. But my point is, it's a subject matter of a certain science, and I oppose the arbitrary use of this term. The way it's used is the following. In translation, it is this. The way it has been used during the crisis, precisely to justify the excessiveness of the measures. The mentality is inferior. The mentality of this nation is, I don't know, comes down to lack of intelligence, because we do not know how to take care of ourselves, and we're ready to risk our lives out of inability to understand that we can transmit a virus. I mean, that's pretty insulting. No nation, no culture, no mentality is that either idiotic, pardon my French, or suicidal. So none of the people here are either idiots or group suicide squads or whatever to go against the measures, if those measures are presented in a logical way, and if the people are convinced in the measures. My point is that the people are in fact, and one should keep that in mind, that too much disciplining, too much treating an entire nation as a child, infantilizing an entire nation of adults, and rendering them or presenting them as completely incapable of taking care of themselves. Therefore, the state will enforce care for them, and it will enforce it through authoritarian measures that triggers revolt, that triggers opposition to the measures. Well, then when people are actually fed up with too much restriction, they simply cannot contain the frustration of being, locked up, controlled, threatened with fines or punishment. They kind of quietly revolt, sometimes through denial. They start, they enter into, these conspiracy theories, like this is all fake, Bill Gates, or, all those stories about the huge conspiracy behind the crisis. Well, but people should not be treated as idiots for thinking that. Mm-hmm. That should be taken as a symptom of a certain psychological state. People are fed up with excessive restriction, so they resort to denial. It's not so much stupidity as it's a psychological state, and it's a state of denial because one has to rationalize why one opposes restrictions. And so this is the rationalization they find. But the real reason for opposing restrictions is that they simply cannot take it anymore. That there are certain limits of confinement and control that a human being can tolerate. Beyond those limits, one feels, like a captured animal in captivity, and one simply wants to break away. Well, then one becomes suicidal, figuratively speaking. Of course, I'm not talking literally. My point is, then one opposes the measures even when they make sense, because one has had enough. So that's my point. Is instead of talking about the inferiority of the nation and undermining the nation, by declaring the mentality as inferior, one should first of all respect the citizens. One should let them take care of themselves, because of course everybody is concerned about their health, and one should not impose excessive measures, because then they backfire, and then the nation gets into denial, and then the nation will oppose the measures even when they make sense. I don't know if it's clear what I'm explaining here, but this is a simple dynamic dialectic of every individual or collective psyche. This is how the psyche works. If one goes too far with the restrictions and not explaining them, so rendering the subject of restrictions mute, incompetent, thinking for him or her or them, instead of letting them thinking for themselves. And so this complete passivization, then locking down of the subject, in the end backfires with an opposition even to the most reasonable measures, because one is already fed up. So that should be kept in mind.
Mm-hmm. Very, very inspirational, thank you. And now when we are talking about the pandemic mainly is a biological health threat, and affected very strongly the whole region, the sea region, the Balkan countries, the world itself. But yet again, old polarizing biases and practices have also survived during this period, meaning that on surface, again, we have seen a lot of attacks to the citizens, a lot of attacks and discrimination between and polarizing the society. So what do you think is the cause of it?
We have had one major polarization, which was actually around the COVID thing. And this polarization kind of divided the people between those who would comply with the state no matter what, and those who would oppose. As I said, there was no civil society that opposed or even monitored enough, let alone be a watchdog of the government. Mm-hmm. So I'm letting that, putting that part of the society aside. And when I am talking about the polarized society, I'm thinking about the general population. The institute I work for, you mentioned at the beginning, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities here in Skopje, performed qualitative study of the social media, kind of like media monitoring in communication studies, just adjusted to the social media. And we measured the pressure of the citizens toward more restrictive and more authoritarian measures, and then pressure of the citizens for the opposite. So it's just it's absolutely astounding that the same population at the beginning asked for more restriction and more repression until a certain point. As soon as the confines lasting for several days started, the opposition to the measures started growing. And we could note that within 3 weeks, we had perhaps a month, we had a complete reversal. At the beginning, 80% of the comments, we studied just the comments, not the likes, or because it was discourse analysis. So in the beginning, 80% of those who commented asked for more and more restrictiveness, perhaps because the people were in panic and did not understand what was going on. From one point on, the critique begins. And we see it under the 5 major, the posts of the 5 most important relevant ministers we analyzed for this qualitative research. And from one point on, when people became worried about their economic existence, when people started doubting the gravity of the health threat, or when people simply became too psychologically disturbed by all the restrictiveness, one could note the frustration, then the resistance to the authoritarian method or the excessive restrictions started. And there we could notice that out of that among the commentators, there was a group that at the beginning was just opposing the excessiveness and repeating the accusation of, say, police state or something like that. Some of the part of the group at the end becomes a sub part of that group, becomes already a group of deniers. They enter into denial because they cannot take it anymore. So it's like, oh, there is no such thing. Even if it is, it's not such a big a deal. This is a conspiracy in order to control us. Some of them do believe that there is such thing as a COVID pandemic, but that it's taken too seriously in order to control the citizens. So people became polarized in that sense. Polarized between them. That's one of the positive things, by the way. This polarization went beyond party polarization in the country and went beyond the ethnic polarization. There were people from different ethnicities or party affiliations that were agreeing or disagreeing about the excessiveness or proportionality of the measures. So a certain polarization around this issue precisely was created. And I would say that the society was at that moment divided between or throughout the state of emergency between those who had certain thresholds of tolerance for restrictions and those who would accept almost anything. So it's a really new thing to a new value to be, if it is still a value, the attitude toward the crisis, to define this new type of polarization. But I would say this was the major polarizing issue in this period. I could not see the usual political polarization as it, I could not notice it, at least during the crisis, as we know it from before. One could notice during the elections some inter-ethnic and intra-ethnic polarizations, but but it was on this higher political level. I did not notice that among the regular people. So maybe it's a good thing to be polarized around how COVID is handled, and social and economical issue becoming the grounds of unification or social cohesion, or differences, debate. It does not have to be a polarization, differences simply. All of them motivated around, as I said, socioeconomical issues mainly, as the result of the crisis. I mean, it's one effect that one did not anticipate, but and one cannot state as insist as bound to happen. But if this happens, this would be a positive thing for the social cohesion. We would be for the first time mobilized around something else, which is not ethnicity, which is not a certain political party, which is a wider social issue, and which is also globally discussed. And we can also enter global discussions on the same topic. So that would perhaps be the occasion of forming certain political values, certain social values that will reorganize the society around different priorities that were simply prompted by the COVID crisis. And of course, do not come down to the pandemic and the public health only, but go beyond that.
And now, as a final question, according to your opinion, how we to move forward, or what are the key steps that we need to undertake to our path of social solidarity?
Again, talking locally or regionally?
Regionally,
okay.
Or however you feel.
Well, I kept talking about Macedonia mostly, but I don't think that it's veering off the topic, because as I said, in both of the studies I was part of, that concern the entire region and its handling of the crisis, the situation is more or less the same. When I said the absolute silence, almost absolute silence of our civil society, in terms of being the watchdog of the government, in terms of offering some kind of critique and defense of civil liberties, the Macedonian case is simply the worst or most worrying in terms of this utter silence of the civil society, with in comparison to the other examples of the other countries of the region. But it is more, the measures were excessive throughout the region. The civil society was more or less passive as it comes to the COVID crisis. The solidarity was immediately, as I said at the beginning, understood somehow falsely, a solidarity with the state being equated with the solidarity with the nation, whereas the civil society should remember that its first concern should be the well-being of the society, which does not always coincide with the priorities of the state, and defend those. So I would say for the forthcoming period, there might be lockdowns which are necessary, but we, during those lockdowns, we as a civil society should be the watchdogs of the government and make sure that the measures are proportionate, that the measures are structured multifacetedly to address the individual concerns of the citizens. Individual rights and concerns are not irrelevant. We are not a Borg. We are not one being during the crisis. We are also individual, no matter how unified in some kind of a social solidarity facing the crisis. We are still within this social body of solidarity. We are still inside of it, individuals with our own individual needs. And not everything can be categorized in a broad terms. We do not all fall under these major social categories that the government can predict. Therefore, in order for these individual liberties to be preserved and respected during the future lockdowns, we need, as I said, a structured, multifaceted approach that will allow the citizen to take responsibility of their actions, to choose the time of movement, to decide about the level of their priorities, whether they're, I don't know, personal, that's also important, family relations, that's also important. We cannot suppress or erase that. Allow them to make to act according to their best judgment. Of course, those who love their closed ones would not risk their health. So simply respect the citizen, come up with measures that allow individual judgment to derogate from the confinement, as the French call it, derogation from the lockdown. Allow, as for example in France, when it was 24/7 quarantine, that the individual citizen decides when to leave the house, to go to the store, to go to a pharmacy, to go to a doctor if it's urgent, at the time of their choosing. All of that can be monitored through codes that are issued by the Ministry of Interior. Usually in France it's the Ministry of Interior, in order to see whether somebody has exceeded or abuse the time. And the state should not act like a North Korean totalitarian state and, I don't know, punish people for 5 or 10 minutes being late when they enact this derogation from confinement, which is actually going out and reporting that you're going out for this or that reason. And you report that through this code that I'm talking about, and you state the number of hours that you need for that. And it is expected that it's a reasonable number of hours. So if you're 15 minutes late, 30 minutes late, something could have happened. You could have, I don't know, lost your key, for example. I don't know, let's just simply imagine all sorts of unimaginable things. Coincidences, what should not be treated as a criminal and fined, arrested because they were 10 minutes early or 10 minutes late with, I don't know, taking their pet for a walk, like the child they tried to arrest this spring. So that kind of tackling the crisis, heavy-handed, extremely heavy-handed tackling of the crisis should not be the way. There should be lockdowns, there should be measures, technology should be used in order for individual freedoms to be respected and allowed. The example with the code was simply an example how technologies can be used, and the state should prepare those the technological tools that will enable a free choice of movement during quarantine, when necessary, when justified, and in a way that can be recorded, monitored, but on the other hand, allows the citizen to choose their priority and their best timing, to have at least the illusion, if not the reality of a true individual choice. Even the illusion matters for the psychological public health. So allow that in spite of the possible lockdowns, and for that the state needs to prepare technologically and otherwise. If they were able to set up all sorts of online solutions for I don't know, all sorts of services during the crisis, they are and should be capable to handle this thing as well. And that also implies a different mentality. Now I will use the word mentality of the government that will not treat minor, I don't know, minor, it's not even disrespect of the rules, minor failure of fully abiding to the rules to be treated as a criminal behavior and to heavy-handedly tackle them. The state, if it expects solidarity from the society and from the civil society, and but first and foremost from the society, so the individual citizens should exude trust. It should not exude threat. It should not exude suspicion toward the I don't know, incompetent citizens that they should take care of. Quite to the contrary, they should exude respect for the citizens, respect for the individual capacity to take care of themselves and their close ones, respect for their freedom of choice, when to leave the house, and judgment what's an absolute priority. Of course, there will be limitations here, but within this limitation, there should be a possibility of free choice. And every stepping off these limits should be first looked at something that could have happened to any normal person or abnormal, regardless, any citizen. Let's not discriminate to anyone. That's the point. Not immediately treat everybody like a criminal and just strike against them with excessive fining, etc. That's a behavior of a police state, of an undemocratic state, of a state that does not respect the civil and individual liberties. That should not be the style of the future lockdowns. There should be a right balance between civil and individual liberties on the one hand, and the necessary quarantines, restrictions, etc. on the other hand. So neither complete anarchy nor an excessive authoritarianism, but a good balance between the two. That would be my proposition as to how to move forward.
We hope you enjoyed the talk. We are inviting you to apply for the upcoming 18th International Youth Conference, which will happen virtually from 5th till 10th of November.